Hello and welcome to my Hour of Devastation limited card review. This is OldManPoole. I have never had the opportunity to do one of these before. I'm excited to be here, excited to be doing. Going forward, be aware that all of my evaluations are going to be with a limited state of mind. That is definitely my area of expertise over constructed, and this is also before the set's been released. Things will change as we get a little bit better idea of the format, and definitely, if you see anything that you think I've evaluated incorrectly, or if you have a different take on one of the cards, comment below. This is a great place to foster discussion, and I'm hoping to learn as much from this as you guys do. So definitely throw out your thoughts on different cards. We're going to go ahead and start with white, and just go around through all the colors: white, blue, black, red, green, and then we'll do a combine for our colorless and multicolored cards, which include some exciting ones. Yeah, let's get right into it. Let's start out with Active Heroism. Now, Active Heroism, I think, is a pretty run-of-the-mill white combat trick. It costs 2 mana for +2/+2, has a couple of extra nice with it. Untapping a creature is relevant, especially in a set where there's Exert, where in regular Amonkhet, if you end up with a couple of aggressive decks, and even with kind of aggressive mid-range decks, blocking was so difficult to achieve that often you ended up just racing with your opponent. And being able to untap, make your creature big, and kill off one of their attacking creatures when you're in a race is a pretty big game. Being able to block conditional creature, I think, is a little bit less relevant, but will come up. Again, if you're racing and you both get really low on life, sometimes it's a good idea to just throw one of your cards in front of a couple. I think your card is unlikely to survive if you do block with 2, but it's a nice little extra bonus. I think Active Heroism will pull its weight in most white decks. It is a combat trick, so it definitely has diminishing returns in multiples. I think I'm going to go ahead and give it a C. Next up, we have Adorned Pouncer, keeping up the slight cat tribal theme from Amonkhet. It's a 1/1 for 1 and a white with Double Strike, and Eternalize, which is the first time we've seen this mechanic. But Eternalize allows you, very similar to Embalm, to bring the creature back after it's died. So you exile the card from the graveyard for a specific cost, and you create a copy of it. The main difference between this and Embalm is the internalized creature always comes back as a 4/4, and it's black as opposed to white, although I don't think that's going to matter all that often. So this card starts out as a 1/1 Double Strike for 2, which I think is okay, not absolutely nuts or anything. It does trade with most 2-drops, it'll fight with 2 power, and will do okay, but doesn't have a whole lot of like flash value. I suppose if you find a cartouche or some other enchantment to throw on it, Double Strike definitely makes that better. But once it does trade early on, you get to bring it back as a 4/4 Double Strike late in the game, and that's a very real card. 2 power attackers is something your opponent can necessarily ignore, and later on they'll have to deal with a pretty big house. 4/4 Double Strike is definitely the real deal. Angel of Condemnation is the next card on our list. It's a 3/3 Flying Vigilant Angel for 2 and 2 white. You can pay 2 a white and tap it, exile another creature, and then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control to the next unstep. And you can pay 2 a white, tap, and exert it, and exile another creature until Angel of Condemnation leaves the battlefield. Now, this card looks absolutely fantastic. The exert is a real cost. They'll take it out for a couple of turns, but this is a card that you can repeatedly remove your opponent's threats. If they don't have a removal spell for the Angel, it's just going to straight win you the game. You do have to take kind of a turn off. You don't get quite the punch that something like a Glorybringer did in the last set, where you get to kill off one of your opponent's creatures immediately. You do have to wait a turn before you can exert, because it requires it to tap. But this is still absolutely great. If your opponent can't interact with it, it's just going to be a straight up bomb. I'm giving it an A- here. There are definitely going to be games where it trades 1 for 1 for removal, and you're fine with that. But if it goes uninteracted with for your opponent, this card single-handedly wins. We'll follow that up with another Angel. We have Angel of the God Pharaoh, which is a 4/4 flyer for 4 and 2 white, and it has cycling for 2. This card is pretty reasonable. 4/4 flyers are pretty big game. Will finish off your opponent in pretty short order if they can't kill it off. This is a good solid late game threat, and the fact that it has cycling on it means that it's not going to really kill you if it's in your opening hand or if you need to find something to do a little bit earlier. Amonkhet showed us that there's an inherent cost with cycling. It's not something you can just do constantly and expect to do well as your opponent beats you down with a bunch of cheap exert creatures. But I think the Angel of the God Pharaoh will still have a place in a lot of decks. I'm giving Angel of the God Pharaoh a solid C. It will do a reasonable job, and if you need a finisher, this can be it, but it's not a card you're real excited to pick early. Next up is Avon of Enduring Hope. This is a 3/3 flyer for 4 and a white, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. This continues our line of white flyers, and it's a pretty reasonable one. Again, not something that you're crazy excited about, but a card that I think will slot into a fair number of decks. The 3 life is not irrelevant. This is a more expensive card, and likely if you're hoping to get through in the skies, you're maybe taking a little bit of a beating early. But a 3/3 flyer does some reasonable work once you've stabilized. This card isn't the best on defense, and it's not the fastest when you're aggressive, but it will break board stalls, and if you end up with both sides kind of staring at each other, flying often is how you end up going over the top. It's fine, something that you will play, but not what you're really on the lookout for either. Prestons Son Mare is a 5/5 horse for 3 and 2 white. Other horses you control have indestructible, and at the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, you create another 5/5 white horse creature token. It's worth noting that the Prestons Son Mare does not give itself indestructible. This can be removed by your opponent, and at least in limited, life gain isn't generally what you're hoping to do. That having been said, there's a fair amount of incidental white life gain, and there's a little bit of it in green as well. And if you make even one other 5/5, this starts being a pretty solid deal pretty fast. I can see this card actually being fairly reasonable. It does die to removal. 5/5 for 5 is fine, but not real exciting. But it does have some significant upside if you do end up with a couple of other cards that give you life gain just in your deck. We're going to go ahead and give Prestons Son Mare a B-, but there are definitely decks where it's going to be dramatically better than that, and decks where it's more like a C, but this has the potential to be very, very good if you get those incidental life gain spells as well. Dauntless Avon is yet another white flying creature. It's a 2/1 flyer for 2 and a white, and whenever it attacks, you can untap another creature that you control. Dauntless Avon, I think, will do some pretty serious work. It'll mesh well with early exert creatures, and a 2/1 flying just for 3 on its own is a pretty reasonable card. This is a little bit more of a support card for white aggressive decks. It doesn't do quite as much just on its own. But a lot of the time this will trade for something in the air and get you a little bit of value, or, if your opponent doesn't have a good flying defense, this can consistently get through for some damage later in the game. I'm going to go ahead and rank it a C+, and it will have the potential for some pretty great openings if your opponent cannot deal with it and you're consistently untapping your exert creatures. Desert's Hold is a white enchantment for 2 and a white. It enchants a creature, and that creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. It also has the additional upside that when it enters the battlefield, if you control a desert, or there is a desert card in your graveyard, you get an extra 3 life. This is pretty solid white removal with good upside in that your opponent's creature can't activate its abilities on top of being able to attack or block. And once in a while, there are a good number of deserts in this set. You're going to gain some life on top of that, and you're going to be pretty happy, pretty excited to play this card in general. Desert's Hold doesn't quite sneak its way into the A range for me, but I do think it's a B+. Being able to remove any of your opponent's creatures, basically with no downside, and the incidental life gain does some serious work. You're going to be happy every time you play a Desert's Hold. Disposal Mummy is a 2/3 white zombie jackal for 2 and a white, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to remove a card from your opponent's graveyard, exile it. This card is unexciting, but not bad. There are a bunch of Eternalized cards running around this format, and you still have value from getting rid of your opponent's Embalms cards from Amonkhet. There's some decent graveyard synergy. There's some cards that care about instants and sorceries in the graveyard in red and blue, and does a reasonable amount. This is a zombie, which is actually maybe as relevant as the exiling a card clause. And in zombie decks, I think you're going to be fine to play this. This is going to be a little bit worse than those who serve a lot of the time, but once in a while you hit an opponent's Embalm card and get some good value. All of these things put together merit Disposal Mummy a solid C. It's not something that you're real excited to take, but it is perfectly fine. Next up, we have Jeru with Eyes Open. This is a 4/3 human warrior for 3 and 2 white, has vigilance. When he enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a Planeswalker card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. And if a source you control would deal damage to a Planeswalker, you get to prevent one of that damage. Now, unfortunately for Jeru, in Limited you're not going to see very many Planeswalkers. Pretty Vigilant threat for 5 is actually a little bit underrate what you're hoping for. So, despite the fact that this is one of the main characters in the story and has some kind of cool flavor going along with him. I think that he is playable, but only just barely. Once in a blue moon, you'll have a Planeswalker in your deck that Gira can go and find for you, but in most instances in Limited, this is going to be a pretty unexciting card. Playable, but pretty unexciting. We're going to give Gira with Eyes Open a D+. Unfortunately for Gira, his Renunciation is pretty low impact as well. Tapping a couple of creatures can be pretty instrumental in a racing situation, but even then, a lot of the time it's not the most powerful effect you can have. This is a little bit cheap as this effect goes for only 1 and a white, and cycling helps it in instances where it won't be good. But I think that if you're playing a white deck that's hoping to beat down, you're hoping to just play another creature over Renunciation a lot of the time. I think there are matchups where the Renunciation will end up being okay, and you can sideboard it in certainly, but I think at its face value it's going to be something like a D+, not something that you're really looking to add into most decks. Next up we have Dutiful Servants, which is a 2/5 vanilla zombie for 3 and a white. This card is pretty passable, pretty unexciting. 5 toughness did end up being fairly relevant in Amonkhet. Having 5 toughness blocked a lot of the exert creatures and 4 was a little bit less likely to. But even so, this is not something you're real excited to be playing. If you are in a dedicated zombies deck, I think it's playable. Outside of that, kind of unexciting. Dutiful Servants is C-, mostly in deference to the fact that it will be okay in zombies, but I think if you're playing just a standard white deck that doesn't really have zombie synergy, this is something you should pass on. I do have to say I love the flavor on this card, though. The commonality it shares with those who serve is just absolutely on point. Beautiful, beautiful flavor and artwork. Next we have the first in the cycle, Gideon's Defeat, which is 1 white for an instant, and it exiles a white creature that's attacking or blocking. On the off chance that's a Gideon Planeswalker, you also get to gain 5 life. Now, the second clause isn't going to be very relevant and limited most of the time, but this is a very, very powerful sideboard card. I don't think this is a card that you'll start in your deck, because it is just blank against any deck that's not white, but it's something that you'll side in aggressively if you have it, and it will do seriously good work when you do. Cards like this are always a little bit difficult to grade, given the fact that they have such a variance in power level depending on what your opponent's playing. So I'm going to go ahead and give it 2 grades here. It's, I think, a D- if you're just playing it into the vacuum. It's something that you can put in your deck, and maybe it'll have some great upside against some people, but this is really something you'd rather sideboard against white decks. And if you are playing a white deck, I think this is going to be absolutely stellar. I'll give it an A- out of the sideboard. Pharaohs Faithful is our next card. This is a 0/4 human wizard for 1 white, but it has the clause that whenever blue, black, or red spell, you gain 1 life. God Pharaohs Faithful is a card that I don't think you're going to be very excited to play in most white decks. It is a card you can bring in if your opponent's really trying to beat down, you're going for something a little bit later on in the game. And 4 toughness blocks some of the 2-drop exert creatures, not usually very good at blocking the 3-drops, but okay. I think this card does gain a medium boost if you're playing blue, black, or red as its secondary color, but honestly, I think in the matchups where you want a 0/4 for 1 are going to be the same either way. If you want that effect, you want that early blocker, you're going to play it no matter what your secondary color is. Main deck, I'm going to give God Pharaohs Faithful a D. It's something that you can play, and there will be matchups where you're happy that you have it, but most of the time, I would rather leave it in the sideboard. Next up is Hour of Revelation, which is the first card in one of the sweetest and most flavorful cycles in the set. I really like the Hours cycle, and this card is pretty powerful. The card itself is 3 and 3 white to destroy all non-land permanents, but Hour of Revelation costs 3 less to cast if there are 10 or more non-land permanents on the battlefield. Now, having 10 or more non-land permanents is going to be pretty rare. I guess if the game goes on to a board stall for a long time, that clause may end up being triggered, but most of the time when there are 10 non-land permanents on the battlefield, you're pretty easily going to be able to cast it for 6 anyway, and that 3 extra mana isn't going to actually be that much of a cost. So there's a little bit of flavor there, but as far as actual gameplay purpose, I don't think it's going to end up mattering all that much. However, destroy all non-land permanents is an effect you really want in Limited. You can play a couple of defensive cards and kind of feign having a bad draw to your opponent, and if they commit 3, 4, 5 threats out to the battlefield and you play Hour, a lot of times the game is just over. When you've got this in your hand, you can kind of play towards it. It is great. And even if you draw it later on in the game, a lot of times you can kind of orchestrate a time when Hour of Revelation will be powerful for you. I think Hour of Revelation deserves a straight A-. It is a card that only sort of resets the board. It doesn't win the game for you all on its own, but it sets you up in a position where you have every opportunity to do so. Now we have Mummy Paramount, which is a 2/2 zombie for 2 and a white. And whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, Mummy Paramount gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Now, this card immediately draws comparison to Binding Mummy, which ended up being a very high pick in Amonkhet, and one of the best cards you can have if you're trying to draft zombies. This is a fine card. I don't think it is as good. Removing a blocker so that your whole team can get in is a very powerful effect, and just pumping the Paramount is not as exciting. That having been said, if you have a lot of zombies in your deck, this is going to be realistically swinging as a 3/3 a lot of the time, and this is pretty good rate for that card. Because of the obvious zombie synergies, Mummy Paramount's going to earn a C+ for me. If you don't have a lot of zombies in your deck, you can take this less highly. Will be okay. It is still a 2/2 for 2. But when you play 15, 16 zombies in the deck, this is going to be a card that you're excited to have. Oketra's Avenger is the first of only 2 white aggressive exert creatures in the set. It's a 3/1 for 1 and a white, and you can exert it as it attacks. When you do, you prevent all combat damage that will be dealt to it this turn. That ends up being a pretty powerful clause. A 3/1 that swings has the disadvantage that most of the time it just trades for your opponent's cards, but this is either your opponent's going to have to throw a card in front of it and just have it jump, or it's going to be getting in for 3 damage every other turn. I think this card is close to as good as Gustwalker was in Amonkhet. This is 3 damage every other turn that your opponent is going to have a tough time interacting with. Sure, your opponent may end up getting a larger defender with 4 toughness and can block Oketra's Avenger, but they do have to keep the creature back on defense, which means that the Avenger is often going to be trading for something larger than itself. And she's also a very good candidate for combat tricks. If you're swinging and your opponent goes ahead and just blocks it, at that point the exert has already gone through, and you're a little bit less susceptible to any removal spells that your opponent might have, and your opponent's pretty incentivized to block because you don't lose anything by attacking, which means you look a little bit less suspicious when you swing into an open blocker. All that, I think, pushes Oketra's Avenger into the B- category. It's kind of an innocuous looking card, but I think it's going to be able to swing as one of the more powerful 2-drops in the set, and it's going to be a card that you're always happy to play if you're an aggressive white deck. Next we have Oketra's Last Mercy, which is a sorcery for 2 white and 1. Your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. Lands you control don't untap during your next untap step. This is a little bit of an interesting card. This represents a lot of life gain for only 3 mana. Realistically, you can probably get something like 15 here. It can be a little bit tricky to know exactly when to play it because you don't want to put yourself in danger of dying to opponent pump spell or something if you try and take a little bit of extra damage. But this is a lot of life gain. The lands you control don't untap during the next untap step is a pretty reasonably large tempo loss, and since this is really a tempo gain spell, it's a little bit interesting to reconcile. I think this card will be at its best when your opponent is just pinging in with a couple of evasive threats a turn, and gaining that 15 life can end up saving you 5, 6 extra turns of life. But if your opponent is just aggressively beating you down on the board, you don't have much of a defense, I don't think Oketra's Last Mercy is going to be able to save you. That having been said, this card does work better in a controlling deck if you've got something like Approach of the Second Suns or Sandworm Convergence, some big final threat that you're hoping to resolve. Oketra's Mercy will buy you some time. With that in mind, I'm going to give Oketra's Last Mercy a C-. I think that the card will do some serious work in some decks, and there are times where it'll be better than that. But most of the time, it's a big life swing, but it's still only a life swing, and that on its own isn't going to be able to turn the game around for you. Next up is Overwhelming Splendor, one of the most expensive aura curses ever printed. This costs 6 and 2 white, enchants a player, and creatures that player controls lose all abilities that have base power and toughness 1/1. They also can't activate abilities that aren't mana abilities or loyalty abilities. If you ever resolve Overwhelming Splendor, you are going to win the game. Basically, nothing your opponent can have interacts favorably with this. All their creatures get really small, stop doing anything. If they don't have an enchantment removal spell, Overwhelming Splendor is going to win. That having been said, Overwhelming Splendor is very, very expensive. You really have to build a deck around it. You have to be willing to commit a lot of resources towards playing for the long game. But if you can play some like card draw and some good defensive threats, if you do manage to find overwhelming Splendor, it doesn't really matter what else is in your deck. You're going to be able to push through. This is an excellent control win condition, but you do have to survive a long time before you can throw it out there. The effect is incredibly powerful, but it's only one card in your deck, and when you have it in your opening hand, you're going to feel really bad about it. Now, I'm going to give Overwhelming Splendor a B. This is a card that if you build around it, can be the best card in your deck, and is a card that if it hits the battlefield, you're going to win the game, basically always. You just can't go ahead and run this in any white deck and expect it to be good, though. Now we have Sandblast, which is 2 and a white, and it deals 5 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. This card has pretty obvious similarities to Impeccable Timing from the last set, and I think is a worse version of it. Impeccable Timing was nice as a 2-cost card because it interacted with a lot of the aggressive Exert cards. You could kill them with the Exert trigger on the stack, and end up doing kind of what you needed to stall out the game. Sandblast costing 1 extra mana means that you're unlikely to be able to play it and another spell in the same turn for the first handful of turns in the game when it will matter the most. And using your third turn to cast Sandblast as opposed to using your second turn to cast Impeccable Timing, I think hurts it quite a bit. It does kill slightly larger creatures, but most of the time you're trying to get rid of those pesky Exerters early on. Sandblast is still removal, and there are times where it ends up being okay for you, but I think it's something like a C- here. You'll play Index if you really need removal and you don't have much else, but this is not your first pick. Saving Grace is a weird card, and one that I've kind of gone back and forth on how I want to evaluate it. It's 1 and a white for an aura with flash. You can enchant a creature you control, and when it enters the battlefield, all damage that will be dealt that turn to you and permanents you control is dealt to that enchanted creature instead. But that creature does get +3 toughness as well. This is a weird card. It sort of looks like a fog, but not really at the same time. You play this on one of your creatures, you can put it on kind of a smaller expendable one, and then all the rest of your blocks or attacks go in your favor, but you do have to sacrifice a card to do it, which means that to get value out of this, you really have to kind of get 2 of your opponent's creatures in the trade as well. I think there are times where that will happen, but a lot of the time Saving Grace won't be able to line up those conditions, and Saving Grace will either linger in your hand or be kind of a miscellaneous +0/+3 enchantment, which isn't really all that great. I think this card has the lead to a lot of pretty crazy blowout moments, but it also have to run it out and don't really get a whole lot of advantage out of it. It is a reasonable way to save your creature from a damage-based removal spell, which has some additional value, but it's a combat trick that doesn't help you get in for more damage. A lot of the time your creature is going to die anyway, just either save you some life or maybe 1 or 2 other creatures on your side. All that coming together means I think Saving Grace is like a C-. It may be worse than that, it may be better. Like I said, it's a tough one to evaluate, but I think that the baseline is going to be a card that you will play, and there'll be times where it's good, but a lot of time is not real exciting. Next up we have Salinity, which is 2 and a white for an enchantment. It says players can't get counters. Counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. Now, despite the kind of crazy combo potential this has for a lot of the constructed formats, this is going to do next to nothing for you in Limited. If your opponent's playing a really, really heavy -1/-1 counter spewing deck, maybe it ends up being a sideboard card. I see an argument for playing it if you're playing a lot of the green and black creatures that put -1/-1 counters on themselves, but even then, this is pretty low impact, and if the draw doesn't line up, it doesn't work at all. This is really not what you want to be doing, not what you want to be building around. I think this card is just a straight up F. Don't put it in your deck, you're going to be right 99% of the time. Next up we have Solitaire Camel. I have a soft spot for camels. This is 2 and a white for a 3/2, and it has lifelink as long as you control a desert or there is a desert card in your graveyard. So this is one of a handful of kind of desert payoff cards that are throughout the set, and there are a lot of desert cards that are incidental advantage that you'll see going around. A 3/2 for 3 on its own is perfectly fine, even if it's not real exciting. And when it does have lifelink, this is a pretty powerful card. In Amonkhet Limited, I frequently got destroyed by Baleful Amen, and this is a worse version of that, but there are some similarities there. Lifelink is going to matter a lot in a race, and like I said, a 3/2 isn't a real bad fail state on its own. I think Solitaire Camel merits a C. It's something that you'll play in your deck even without deserts, but with deserts the upside is pretty real. Steadfast Sentinel is another Eternalized card. It's a 2/3 for 3 and a white with Vigilance, and then internalizes for 4 and 2 white. I'm not wild about this card. A 2/3 for 4 even with Vigilance is pretty unexciting. It does turn into a reasonable card late game. 4/4 with Vigilance is pretty big. Your opponent will have to pay attention to it. But Eternalize is kind of expensive. It's not particularly good at beating down when you play it the first time, and it's not real great on defense. I think Steadfast Sentinel's just a D+. It's playable as one of your last cards, but I think it's something that is going to fly around the draft table, and if you need to pick up some, you'll have the opportunity. There are better 4-drops, though. Next we have Steward Solidarity, which is a 2/2 for 1 and a white. You can tap and exert it, and create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance. This card I've gone back and forth on a couple of times. 2/2 for 2 is perfectly fine on its own, and the upside is pretty good if you end up in a board stall. I think if you do play this on turn 2, most white decks are just going to want to use it to beat on your opponent. Getting a 1/1 every other turn is pretty slow, and it is like a valuable effect, especially if you're running a whole bunch of group Anthem effects in your deck. But it is very slow. I think you'll kind of swing with the Steward for as long as you can effectively, and then just sit back and start making tokens thereafter. The Steward doesn't ask a whole lot from you, and it does a pretty good job whether you draw it on turn 2 or you draw it on turn 6. So I think it does merit a C+. It's not massively high impact, but it's a card that you'll want in your deck. Sunscourge Champion is a 2/3 for 2 and a white. When it enters the battlefield, you gain life equal to its power, and it has Eternalize for 2 and 2 white, and discard a card. This card seems pretty okay to me. The 2 life gain when it enters the battlefield is not super high impact, but it's nice to have. A 2/3 for 3 is not a real exciting rate, but it's okay too. And the fact that you get to turn it around for a 4/4 that gains you 4 life when it enters the battlefield late game is pretty good. You don't have to play this until you've got an extra land in your hand that you want to pitch, so I think the discarded card clause actually won't end up being that expensive. I think you'll be happy to play the first couple of Sunscourge Champions you have in your deck, and I don't think it'll ever really disappoint. It still doesn't fare super favorably against a lot of the exert creatures, and maybe it doesn't do quite enough against aggressive decks, although the life gain does go a fair way to helping with that. I think it's going to be a C+. I think it's something you're going to want in your deck. It's going to do a little bit when it comes in the first time, and it's going to give you value the second time you play it as well. So I think that playing Sunscourge Champion is kind of what you want to be doing. Next we have Unconventional Tactics, which is 2 and a white, and is definitely up there as one of the funniest cards in the set. If you haven't had a chance to check out the art, definitely do so. It gives target creature +3/+3, and it gains flying until the end of the turn, which on its own seems pretty unexciting. It's a more expensive Mighty Leap, and it's sorcery speed, so that kind of hurts it. But whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay white. If you do, you return Unconventional Tactics from your graveyard to your hand. That's pretty powerful. Being able to add Kicker to all your zombie cards to bring this back means that it's going to give you a good amount of inevitability in the late game. If your opponent kills it in response, the spell is kind of free anyway. Getting through with like a 5/5 flyer in the air, that's a pretty big deal. I think Unconventional Tactics is going to be a great finisher for zombie decks and something you want to see in your deck. Inevitability this provides, even though it's only really a defensive card, actually does merit it a B. If you're not playing in the zombies deck, it's obviously quite a bit worse, but if you are in that deck, this is one of your better payoffs. Our last white card is Vizier of the True. It's a 3/2 human cleric for 3 and a white. You may exert it as it attacks, and whenever you exert a creature, you tap a target creature an opponent controls. This is pretty good in an exert deck. It's perfectly fine on its own. It's kind of a worse version of On-Crop Crasher, but that card is pretty good. I think you will play a worse version most of the time. But if you have this in the Nut exert deck, and if you have a couple other exert creatures out on the battlefield, your opponent just cannot block at all. You exert all your cards, you hit them for a bunch, and nothing on their side can set up blocks. Now, one of the advantages of exert in general is it kind of disincentivize blocking, so this is kind of a double whammy in that case. But the fact that you take out all your opponent's best creatures when you come in means you can kind of use this as a falter effect late in the game and just make one big swing and finish off the game. And miscellaneous advantage every time you exert is pretty powerful too. I think Vizier of the True is going to end up being something like a B in most decks. Just on its own, it's perfectly fine, and if you do have other exerters in this deck, it can do some really serious work pretty quickly. Alright, and that is white in Hour of Devastation. I think white looks pretty reasonable. I don't think it's as aggressive as it was in Amonkhet. But there are a good number of cards that give inevitability. A lot of the flyers end up being pretty powerful. It's got a handful of things that the zombie deck I think I'll be looking to play. So I think overall it'll be a color that you're not unhappy to find yourself in. Thanks everyone so much for watching. Again, this is the first set review I've ever done. If you've got any feedback, things that you'd like me to do a little bit differently, or things I could do to improve the display, or really anything that comes to mind, definitely shout it out in the comments. If you have any differing opinions on the cards, definitely shoot that my way as well. Thanks everyone so much for watching. I'll be back again tomorrow with blue.